Morgan Blake. Entry Journal number 004. The Haunting of Blackwater Lighthouse. He never gives back what it takes, but sometimes it leaves behind something more sinister. It was late in the evening when I received the call. The voice on the other end was shaky, tinged with desperation. They spoke of a remote lighthouse, perched on the edge of Blackwater Bay, and of a series of mysterious deaths that had left the small town in a state of fear. They needed someone to investigate, someone who could uncover the truth behind the tragedy that had befallen their community. That someone, it seemed, was me. As I listened, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than what was being told. The voice mentioned a haunting, strange lights, and eerie whispers that plagued the lighthouse and the surrounding town. But it was the mention of the sea, dark and unforgiving, with a history of taking more than it gave, that sent a shiver down my spine. I agreed to take the case, knowing full well that it would not be an easy one. There was something about the ocean that had always unsettled me, its vastness, its depth, its secrets hidden beneath the surface. But I was not one to back down from a challenge, especially when it came to uncovering the truth. The journey to Blackwater Bay was long and arduous, taking me through winding roads and desolate landscapes. As I drove, the weather seemed to worsen with each passing mile. Thick clouds rolled in, darkening the sky and casting a gloomy pall over the land. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and sending leaves swirling in the air. It was as if the very elements were conspiring to keep me away. I arrived in Blackwater Bay just as night was falling. The town was smaller than I had imagined, little more than a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a narrow, winding road. The sea was ever present, its waves crashing against the rocky shore with a relentless fury. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, a reminder of the ocean's power to both give life and take it away. The lighthouse stood at the far end of town, a solitary figure against the darkening sky. Its white tower was streaked with black, a result of years of exposure to the harsh elements. The light at the top flickered weakly, barely cutting through the mist that had settled over the bay. It was a bleak and foreboding sight, one that sent a chill down my spine. The streets were empty as I made my way through the town. The few people I saw hurried past, their heads down, avoiding eye contact. There was an air of unease that hung over the town, a sense that something was not quite right. It was as if the entire place was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. I found the inn at the center of town, a small, run-down building that looked as though it had seen better days. The sign above the door creaked in the wind, and the windows were dark, giving the place an abandoned feel. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the wooden floorboards creaking underfoot. The innkeeper was an elderly man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets. He glanced up as I entered, his expression a mix of curiosity and wariness. I introduced myself, explaining that I was there to investigate the recent deaths at the lighthouse. The man's expression darkened, and he nodded grimly, as if acknowledging the weight of what was to come. Not many come here by choice, he implied with his demeanor. Blackwater Bay has a way of keeping its secrets. He looked at me as if hoping I was prepared for what I might find. I assured him that I was, though in truth, I wasn't entirely sure. There was something about this place that felt different from other cases I had worked on. It was as if the very air was charged with an unseen energy, a tension that I couldn't quite place. The innkeeper showed me to my room, a small, sparsely furnished space with a single bed and a window that overlooked the bay. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks filled the room, a constant reminder of the ocean's presence. As I unpacked my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of seagulls crying overhead, their calls harsh and piercing. The sky was overcast, the clouds hanging low and heavy, threatening rain. I dressed quickly and made my way downstairs, eager to begin my investigation. The innkeeper was waiting for me in the small dining area, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. He nodded in greeting as I approached. My plan was to start at the lighthouse. It seemed the most logical focal point of the investigation, given the circumstances. The innkeeper's expression grew somber. His demeanor seemed to carry a warning, as if to suggest that caution was needed. I sensed that the lighthouse carried a reputation among the locals, one that inspired fear rather than respect. From what I gathered, 3 men had died in the past 6 months. All of them were connected to the lighthouse in some way. The first had fallen from the tower, an accident, according to official reports. The second man drowned in the sea, despite being known as a strong swimmer. The third was found at the base of the cliffs, with no clear explanation of how he got there. The innkeeper implied that these incidents, coupled with the stormy nights during which they occurred, were tied to the mysterious disappearance of the last lighthouse keeper, Thomas Hale. Thomas Hale had vanished during a storm years ago, his body never found. The innkeeper's tone suggested that some believed he had been taken by the sea, while others thought he had gone mad and thrown himself off the cliffs. Armed with this information, I set off for the lighthouse. The path leading to it was narrow and treacherous, winding along the edge of the cliffs. The wind had picked up, tugging at my coat and sending chills down my spine. The sea roared below, its waves crashing against the rocks with a deafening force. As I neared the lighthouse, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The tower loomed above me, its white walls streaked with black, the light at the top barely visible through the mist. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, a reminder of the countless lives the sea had claimed over the years. The lighthouse keeper's quarters were a small, cramped building attached to the base of the tower. The door creaked open as I approached, revealing a dark, dusty interior. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and neglect. The furniture was sparse, a single bed, a wooden desk, and a few scattered personal items. It was clear that no one had lived here for a long time. I spent the day examining the quarters, searching for clues that might shed light on the recent deaths. I discovered an old journal tucked away in a drawer, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The entries were written in a neat, precise hand, detailing the daily life of a lighthouse keeper. But as I read further, the tone of the journal began to change. The entries grew more erratic, filled with references to strange lights out at sea, ghostly figures that appeared in the dead of night, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The final entry was dated the night of Thomas Hale's disappearance. It was barely legible, the writing frantic and disjointed. Hale wrote of a betrayal, of someone close to him who had wronged him in some unspeakable way. He mentioned the lights growing closer, and of a voice calling to him from the sea. The entry ended abruptly, the last few lines trailing off into nothing. I closed the journal, my mind racing with questions. Who had betrayed Hale? And what connection did the lights have to his disappearance? I had a feeling that the answers lay somewhere within the lighthouse, hidden among the shadows and secrets that had festered there for years. As night fell, the wind began to howl, rattling the windows and sending a chill through the lighthouse. The beam of light swept across the room at regular intervals, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. I decided to stay in the keeper's quarters for the night, determined to experience whatever it was that had driven Hale to madness. The hours passed slowly, the storm outside growing more intense with each passing minute. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was deafening, a constant reminder of the sea's power. I could feel the tension in the air, a sense of anticipation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. And then, just as I was beginning to doze off, I heard it, the faintest whisper, carried on the wind. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with an eerie, disembodied voice. It seemed to be coming from the lighthouse itself, calling to me, beckoning me to come closer. I resisted the urge to investigate, telling myself that it was just the wind playing tricks on my mind. But the whisper continued, growing more urgent with each passing moment. I could feel a presence in the room, something unseen but very real. It was as if the lighthouse was alive, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I stayed in bed, my eyes fixed on the door, my ears straining to catch any sound. The whispering continued for what felt like hours before finally fading away into the storm. But even then, I knew that whatever it was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The following morning, I set out to gather more information from the locals. The innkeeper had mentioned an old fisherman named Samuel, a man who had lived in Blackwater Bay his entire life. I found him down by the docks, repairing a battered old boat that looked as though it had weathered many storms. Samuel was a tall, wiry man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen more than their fair share of tragedy. He greeted me with a nod, his hands never pausing in their work. I learned that the lighthouse had always been a place of fear and superstition among the locals. Samuel spoke of the sea as if it were a living entity, one that took what it wanted and never gave it back. The lighthouse, he implied, was cursed, a place where the line between the living and the dead was blurred. He mentioned that there was something out there, something that had been in Blackwater Bay long before any of the current inhabitants. The old ones had known of it, made offerings to keep it at bay, but that knowledge had been lost over time. Now, whatever it was hungry, feeding on fear and pain. Samuel's words sent a chill down my spine. The more he spoke, the more I realized that whatever haunted the lighthouse was not just a ghost, but something far older and more sinister. It was a force that had claimed the lives of the men who had died there, and it wasn't done yet. Despite Samuel's warnings, I knew I couldn't leave. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of the puzzle still missing. I thanked Samuel and made my way back to the lighthouse, determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Over the next few days, I delved deeper into the history of the lighthouse, poring over old records and speaking to anyone who would talk to me. I found references to the lighthouse dating back over a century, to a time when Blackwater Bay was little more than a fishing village. The lighthouse had always been there, a solitary sentinel against the sea, but it had a dark history, one that was rarely spoken of. There were stories of ships that had gone missing, of fishermen who had disappeared without a trace, of strange lights that appeared on the horizon, luring sailors to their doom. The lighthouse, it seemed, had always been a place of fear and superstition, a place where the line between the living and the dead was blurred. I returned to the journal I had found in Hale's quarters, reading and rereading the entries, looking for any clue that might explain what had happened. The more I read, the more I realized that Hale had been a man tormented by something far beyond the ordinary. His journal was filled with references to betrayal, to voices that whispered in the night, to lights that moved of their own accord. But it was the final entry that haunted me the most. In it, Hale spoke of a betrayal so deep, so unforgivable, that it had driven him to the brink of madness. He wrote of a pact, made long ago, that had been broken, and of the terrible price that had to be paid. The lights, he believed, were a sign that the sea was calling for payment, a payment that could only be made with blood. As I closed the journal, I felt a sense of dread settle over me. Whatever had happened to Hale, whatever curse haunted the lighthouse, it was still very much alive. And I had a feeling that I was getting closer to the truth, closer to the thing that had taken Hale, and that now threatened to take me as well. That night, the storm outside was relentless, the wind screaming like a banshee and the waves battering the cliffs with a force that shook the entire lighthouse. I sat at the desk, the journal open before me, trying to make sense of the fragmented thoughts and cryptic entries. But the words seemed to blur on the page, my mind struggling to piece together the puzzle. Suddenly, the lights inside the room flickered and then went out, plunging me into darkness. The only light came from the beam of the lighthouse, sweeping across the room in regular intervals. I stood up, feeling my way to the door, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed, rooted to the spot as if an unseen force held me in place. Panic surged through me as I realized I was completely at the mercy of whatever presence haunted this place. Then, I heard it, the whispering. It was closer now, all around me, growing louder and more intense. The sound filled my ears, drowning out the storm, and I could feel the pressure in my head building, as if it were going to explode. The voice was no longer disembodied, it was right next to me, chillingly close. I tried to fight it, to scream, to do anything, but I was helpless. The whispering became a low, guttural chant, reverberating through my skull, pulling me deeper into the darkness. The room spun around me, the shadows lengthening and twisting into monstrous shapes. And then, the floor beneath me gave way. I plummeted into a void, the darkness swallowing me whole. There was no sense of up or down, no sense of time, only the cold, unyielding grip of whatever had taken hold of me. I was no longer in the lighthouse. I was somewhere else, somewhere far worse. The next thing I knew, I was lying on a cold, hard surface, the taste of salt thick in my mouth. I opened my eyes to find myself in a dimly lit chamber, the walls slick with moisture. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of the sea. I tried to move, but my hands and feet were bound, held in place by thick, rusted chains. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. I was trapped, captured by whatever malevolent force had haunted the lighthouse and now claimed me as its prisoner. I struggled against the chains, the metal cutting into my wrists, but it was no use. The whispering returned, echoing through the chamber, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. They spoke of betrayal, of the sea's wrath, of a debt that had to be paid. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, or what was left of one. His skin was pale and waterlogged, his eyes sunken and hollow, and his clothes were tattered and soaked through. He looked at me with a gaze that was both empty and filled with unspeakable torment. It was Thomas Hale. He was not dead, at least not in the way one might expect. He had been taken, consumed by whatever cursed force had claimed this place, and now he was neither living nor dead, a wraith bound to the will of the sea. Hale reached out a hand, cold and clammy, and placed it on my forehead. The contact sent a jolt of pain through my body, and I felt the last remnants of my strength draining away. The whispering grew louder, the voices chanting in unison, demanding payment. I realized, in that moment of despair, that I had been lured here, just as Hale had been. The lighthouse was a trap, a beacon not of light but of darkness, drawing in those who were doomed to pay the sea's price. As consciousness began to slip away, I knew that my only hope was to somehow escape this nightmare, to break free of the chains that bound me, and to uncover the truth behind the curse of Blackwater Lighthouse before it was too late. But as the darkness closed in around me, I knew that the fight for my life, and my very soul, had only just begun.